Do you like to work with metal, fire, electricity? Would you like to make money doing it? At Southwestern, we can help make your dream a reality. With our degree and certificate programs in welding, you'll be prepared for a career in the welding and fabrication industry in as little as a year. Check out our website and let Southwestern spark your career in welding today.
This is Southwestern's dental assisting program. In just one short year, you could be a dental assistant. Sign up now for your one-year dental assisting certification.
my name is Ron Metzger, and I've been teaching geology at Southwestern Oregon Community College for the last 20 years.
Hi, my name is Ron Metzger, and I've been teaching geology at Southwestern Oregon Community College for the last 20 years. It's an exciting time to be teaching in the health and science fields at SWOCC as we work towards funding a new health and science facility at the college. Colito Hall is the building I work in, and it houses our science labs. It was constructed in 1965, and the labs have undergone relatively little updating since that time. Over the years, we faculty have provided an exceptional foundation in the lab sciences. It's relatively easy to see how an investment in the health side of the facility will pay dividends in our local communities. The added lab and class space will allow additional cohorts of nursing students in new programs. This will allow our local residents to go through the programs and earn family wage jobs at Bay Area Hospital and all of our other local healthcare providers. As we look forward, it'll be interesting to see what we accomplish as a college and community with lab facilities and equipment equal to the task of teaching in the 21st century. I hope you will work with me as we move forward with this project. Boom, 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 boom. So, thank you all, and I'm just going to go one more time like this because we've raised the $8 million. We're like within $1.25 or so of the $1 million match that the Beetham family put up. So hopefully by the time I do the introduction for the next talk, which will be some date in October that I don't know when, hopefully giant me is no longer part of the introduction, and by that no, not oh, then I can go back to being anonymous me like I was for 7 years. That's tough. But basically one of the things, presumably by the next time that I do an introduction to a geology lecture on the stage, we will already have sunk some shovels into the ground for the new health science building. So that's something over the course of the last year to two that I'm very, very proud of, that some of the folks that have regularly attended these events have contributed, even by just kicking in a few bucks to the donation jar. Usually the donation jar goes to keeping this thing going, but the past year we've actually purchased a couple of seats in the new building as part of the donations that folks have contributed. So for that I'm eternally grateful and really looking forward to a new building and not having giant me in the background. Many of you also potentially had an opportunity to talk to folks from both South Slough and the Coquel tribe. If you didn't, they'll be out in the lobby afterwards for a little bit as well. With a talk about landscapes, I figured it was a benefit to have a couple of our local groups that have a really strong connection to our local landscape in our local tribes as well as South Slough to be a component of this evening's event. And also, if you didn't sign one of those sign-in sheets, if you take a minute on the way out to do that, I would appreciate that as well. So Josh Roering was here once, and neither of us can figure out when that was, but it was a while ago. He still looks young, but we were both young. We were both new to the game of teaching, and you still look like you're couple years ago, so that's pretty good. But that was a different room, and that was over in Eden Hall. Any of you out there actually go to any of the geology lectures in Eden Hall? Fantastic. Yeah, it got a little bit bigger over the years, so we went for the larger hall. So it's a little bit more extreme than last time Josh was here. But I found out why I liked him. Turns out I spent 11 years in Iowa City, and he was born in Iowa City. So his dad was in graduate school. You were probably born in Iowa City while I was there, so and I'll give you that one anyway. He went up to Minnesota and he did his academic work at Berkeley, and one of the things that I've found intriguing over the years, not only is Josh incredibly personable, also a great speaker for getting complicated points across, but also has spent a lot of time doing research down here as well. So every couple of years finds him working his way back through Coos County to work on the geomorphology of the region and the landscapes of this region. And Friday afternoon, Josh sent me the real title to this talk, and I was going to bring the original title, but it would take too long to talk, and it would be 9 o'clock already or something. And so lasers and Cascadia. So that's all I needed was lasers. So it's my great pleasure to introduce who just came over this afternoon from the U of O, Josh Roering.
A geologist without slides it's a sad thing. Got to have our props to talk to. Ron, thanks so much for having me out. It's even more of a thank you to you for coming out on a Saturday night. I really appreciate it. What I'm going to try to do is make it worth your while. Like Ron said, I've been cutting my teeth as a geologist in this place for a long time, and so I have deep roots. After the '96 storms, I was working with some colleagues, and we rented an apartment in North Bend and lived on plastic lawn furniture for about a month, and ate a lot of pizza and learned a lot about the landscape here. And so we have a lot of great memories from this part of the world. So I'll allude to a little bit of that. What I'm going to do today is tell you about some goings-ons in your backyard, and along the way I'm going to refer to a lot of people. And it feels really disingenuous for me to stand up here and talk about these things, because it's really this cohort of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers that have come through, and colleagues and others that do the work, and I get to stand up here and talk about it. So I'm going to allude to their contributions along the way, but just sort of think of me as the messenger for the good work of a lot of people. Okay, let's start out with this view, and this is a map on the right of North America made by a Frenchman in the year 1720. There's something missing on this map. Do you see it? The westernmost point on that map is Cape Blanco, and beyond that, there's, well, let me get my pen going, sorry. There we go, back to it. I'll forego the pen for now, I'll figure it out. Is this big blank area, and this is obviously a metaphor for how far we've gone in just 300 years in understanding this landscape. But I want to contrast that huge blank spot in this map with what you see on the left, which is a sliver of a single tree, which is illuminated by about 10,000 laser pulses. So in 300 years, we've gone from this big blank space to knowing the details of the canopy of virtually every single tree out there. And my job tonight is to try to walk you through some of these things and give you a little bit of a brief tour of how we've been able to transform our understanding of this landscape through technology, and as well as a lot of just boots on the ground geology as well. So to illustrate this, I want to put a fine point on this right from the get-go. This is exactly what we were handed as geology students. And any geologist, for that matter, started their job in the field with a topographic map like this. This is contours. This is not, you're not seeing the face of Jesus or someone else in here. This is not a Rorschach test. These are contour maps that you don't see that much anymore. This is the landscape. And this is what we were supposed to fill in with information. So as geologists, we were given this and said, your job is to understand the structure, the faults, the rocks, landslides, glacial history, something out there. So we would go out, we'd make observations in the field, we would see all these things around us, and then the first thing we had to do is put those observations on the map. And I can tell you, we spent a great deal of time trying to figure out where the heck we were on this map. It was an endeavor that required these Brunton compasses that you'd see where you'd have to point at something far away and figure out your orientation. It was almost like detective work because these maps had very little to do, or they had somewhat to do with the landscape, but they just didn't portray it in the level of detail that allows you to connect easily what was right in front of your face and what was on this map. So we spent a lot of time imagining things. Now, what I'm going to do is show you, and some of you have probably seen this, this is today. So this is a map generated from airborne laser altimetry. This, I'm going to show you exactly how this comes about in just a second, but this has completely turned the tables on how we understand landscapes, because now, instead of trying to find our way on the map, we have this complete opposite experience where we're walking through the landscape and we can see something in front of us, and we can't, on the map I should say, we can see a feature, a landslide, something, and we have a limited ability to actually identify it with our eyes. So these maps have actually transformed it where they're actually illuminating things in front of us that we wouldn't recognize but for this technology. To illustrate that, I'm going to zoom in on this little spot on the left over here, and just forgive me a second. The PowerPoint, I'm having trouble with my pen, but so be it. I'm going to zoom in on that little spot right there. These are landslides coming into a creek. I've been in the situation in the field now where you're walking around, and without the LiDAR data, we don't realize we're actually walking on top of a landslide or some other feature like this. So this has completely revolutionized how we visualize, how we understand the landscape. So that has happened in my lifetime as a geologist. So what I want to do is walk you through how we've been able to transform our understanding of Cascadia with this technology. So two things define our part of the world up here, that big blank spot we just showed you a second ago. They are not hipsters and craft beer. Those are things that are a big part of Cascadia. As a scientist, though, I'm required to say that the two things that define this landscape around us are subduction zones and big trees. Subduction zones give us volcanoes, they give us mountains, they give us the Willamette Valley, they give us rocky coasts and sand dunes. Everything that we identify with our part of the world up here is driven by this subduction zone, which has slip along the surface. I apologize. Let me try to make sure I can get the pen working, because, oops. There it is. Thank you. Right, so you guys live, and hopefully everyone knows that you're living on top of a subduction zone that generates these earthquakes and tsunamis and so forth. All that happens there, but there's all kinds of other things that I just referred to, the Willamette Valley, these volcanoes and so forth, that really define our region. Now, draped on top of that are these things. And in this part of the world, you cannot escape the influence of big trees. They are deeply rooted in our landscape, our economy, the culture, the heritage of this place. These are the two things that define Cascadia, in my opinion, and we're going to talk about how they come together. Now, to tell the tale of the understanding of the landscape, it goes way beyond our time, way prior to our time. The tribes, the Native Americans of the Northwest, have been here for millennia, and they still are telling us about the landscape as you just saw out in front. So if you look through their oral tradition, there's this rich history of the story of earthquakes, the story of landslides, floods, and there's an incredible amount of information encompassed in those oral histories that are recorded as well as being told today. These stories have been actually used in a recent scientific endeavor, if you haven't heard this, to actually independently date the last subduction zone earthquake, which we know happened on January 26th, about 9 o'clock in the year 1700. But through these historical stories have been bracketed to a pretty narrow range. So it's, in the absence of any other types of information, this oral history is quite powerful for understanding the past. In fact, if you take a deeper look into those histories, you can actually find allusions to the recurrence of these earthquakes and the fact that it was many, many generations between these events. So this effort that combined the tribes and seismologists and other scientists to look at what was contained in those is actually quite profound. And there's a really nice paper that's written about that. If you come forward and look at the European presence, one of the foremost scientists that came to Cascadia and made an important contribution is a guy that became a famous professor of mineralogy. He spent his later parts of his career staring at minerals in great detail under microscopes, and he did this at Yale University here as a professor. All geologists know of Dana's Mineralogy. It was a book that everyone had. He started off on a boat for 4 years as part of a scientific expedition. They spent a lot of time traversing the southern tip of South America. They went to Australia, New Zealand. They went to Hawaii. They went back to Hawaii. They went back to Tahiti. Their job was to go beyond discovery, but look at the next wave scientific collections. They collected some of the first specimens that became the Smithsonian Institute. So this 4-year expedition that collected fossils to living creatures to rocks, basically gave the beginnings to our national treasure that is in the Smithsonian today. Their voyage took a major turn on the Oregon coast. That is an artist's rendition of the wreck of the Peacock. This is in 1841. And sort of nestled in all those waves in there is a ship that's nearly vertical. This is the Peacock where a lot of these scientific specimens were being carried. So Dana and his colleagues, there was about 10 other scientists on this voyage, got stuck on the bar just outside of Astoria. So this was the end fate, the bitter end of many ships trying to get into the Columbia River, and they lost a lot of scientific specimens, but they had the benefit as a result of landing right there. You see the X where they ended up on the coast of being stuck in northwest Oregon for quite a while, or what would become northwest Oregon. And instead of taking the coast all the way down to San Francisco, Dana and his colleagues ended up going down the Willamette Valley. And at that time, a lot of these new expeditions were looking at iconic, different-looking things. They were curious about what's unique about these places. So they were curious as to what defined the Pacific Northwest as we know it today. So this is something called Saddle Mountain. And if you've ever been out to Seaside or up to Cannon Beach and places like that, there's this really odd-looking mountain, and it caught Dana's attention even back then. So there's his rendition of that he later published, and that was one of the few things that stood out to him. This next quote is straight out of Dana's journals, because the rest of his way down the coast, he said, this whole region, he's talking about the Oregon coast, he's talking about my backyard, our backyard here, right? This whole region elsewhere is broken with hills of little seeming interest and bristled with evergreens, presenting in general little that is striking an outline. So it kind of hurts as a geologist, I have to say, when you read something like that, and someone that, takes that little regard of this landscape that I hold dear, that I spend my career trying to better understand, and that the very first famous geologists that came through this place just sort of had, just this very dismissive, patronizing view of the landscape. The problem was they were spending most of their time staring at these big trees, and they wanted to put their hands on the rocks to try to see what the heck was underneath all this stuff. So Dana's initial efforts were thwarted by these things right there. Now, if we could imagine Dana doing this today, this is what you'd experience. My favorite way to introduce people into your backyard, the Oregon Coast Range, and you can see we're zooming into somewhere you know very well. This is just along the Umpqua River, just north of you here near Reedsport. If you take a little Google Earth dive and you start to zoom around and look at the mountains that are just inland of us, you can see kind of what Dana was talking about. Everywhere looks the same. It's a remarkably interesting landscape. It's mountainous, it's steep, it has soil, and it's a great place to grow trees. It's also home to landslides and other things. But as you look at it, if I dropped you in any particular part of the Coast Range without a map or a GPS, you'd often have a heck of a time finding your way out. Everything really looks the same. And that was really captured by Dana's initial perception of this landscape, is how unique it was in the fact that it was so similar everywhere you looked. So what I want to do today is pull back that veil, pull back that curtain, and show you all of the richness that is in our backyard here and how it helps inform our understanding of subduction processes and the landscape and how we relate to it. So this is kind of what Dana saw. This is air photos that we used to fly, and this is how we did a lot of geology, is by taking views from above, looking at those photos and trying to then make maps and understand. So this is another sort of featureless, maybe unexciting little patch of topography, and there's a meandering river which often sticks out even from airplanes, you can see, and there's a lake up there. When we scan that same piece of terrain with this airborne technology, I'm going to show you how we do that in just a second. That's a digital representation right now of all of these leaves and trees that are standing between us and the landscape surface. And so now I'm going to digitally remove all of those trees, and that's what you see. So rather than this just featureless, amorphous, tree-covered surface, you have this really charismatic landslide coming down into this river that looks pretty fresh. It looks pretty decent. And the morphology of that thing was actually sufficient to create this lake up in the head of that, which is kind of cool. So how do we do this? How do we generate this new understanding of the landscape? This is the bread and butter of LIDAR. LIDAR is the short word for laser altimetry. LIDAR is part of the vernacular of all science right now, so ecologists use it to study trees, geologists use it, anyone that is interested in landscapes uses LIDAR, including FEMA, when they're trying to map the floodplain, when they're updating the tsunami inundation maps that you all are hopefully familiar with here, they're using new LIDAR data, so it is everywhere and it is essential for a lot of the work we do. You need an airplane. You shoot a laser from the base of that airplane. It shoots about 200,000 times a second, so it's an amazing instrument. You also need to know where that airplane is, so it has a GPS on the top of it, and it also has an inertial navigation system, so it knows what the airplane is doing in terms of its tilt and roll and yaw and all those other things that define an airplane's path as it's careening through the air. Those things, those laser pulses hit the ground, the trees, everything in between. I work in other parts of the world. We do some work in the savannah in Africa, and we have a perfectly mapped giraffe that's defined by laser pulses. So whatever is down there, you will map it with these laser pulses. The key then is to figure out what you want to map. So if you're an ecologist and you're interested in trees or a forester, you can focus on all the pulses that hit the branches. If you're interested in geology and a lot of the features I'm going to tell you about today, you have to trim those things away digitally, and you focus on all the blue dots down at the bottom of the screen, and those are defining the land surface. So there's a ridiculous amount of computational work that is required in order to trim away, to digitally deforest the landscape, if you want to think of it that way, or keep it in terms of defining those features that you're most interested in. Here's a way to put all of that into one little dynamic visual. This is a little catchment in Northern California, just south of Eureka, Arcata, in the King Range. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a little digital flight through this patch of LIDAR. And as we do that, we can sweep away all those trees and reveal the landscape below. So I like landslides, so that's one of the reasons why we went to this place. So it's a landslide-riddled place. This place is just rotten with them. But the detail is just striking. When you compare this depiction of the landscape to what I showed with those original topographic maps, it's just a game changer. Those lines etched in the sides of those hills are single-lane gravel roads, just something we couldn't ever imagine being able to understand before we had this technology. So we can do a great deal. Who knows where this is? A beer to the first person that raises their hand. Who recognizes this? In the back. Where? No? That's Coos Bay. We're in this picture right here. So these are the trees, and if I strip away the trees, there we are. And Ron, are we in this figure, or is this just south of us? There's the trees. Is that Empire Lake or that other water body on the left over there? That's the reservoir? Okay. So we're just north of this. I apologize. We're not quite in there. So you can go and look at your house. And so you might not, some of these areas in the middle of this plot right here, it's really bad to learn in a talk that your house is built on a landslide or something like that. So I'll shy away from circling anything in here. But there's a lot of great details. There's little watersheds, there's catchments, there's ancient landslides. There's the estuary and all the features that come along with that as well. So let's talk about Cascadia more generally. And the last thing I want to do is give you the sort of death and destruction talk of, we're living in this treacherous landscape. But there we go. So I'm just kidding. The point here is not to raise the specter of all these things, but again, use this as the opposite, to point out that we have an incredibly improved understanding of how this place works because of the amount of science that's been done here. So the last thing you want to do is read this New Yorker article of 2015 that got so many people up in a tizzy, and I had relatives calling saying you have to move because everything west of I-5 is toast, and all these amazing amount of hysteria that it created. No, last thing I want to do is run. We understand it, we are dealing with it better, and that's the whole point, is that we can use all these things to live in a way that appreciates and accounts for these hazards, to live with them in as much harmony as we can. So let's start out with a little bit of a look through the different aspects of the subduction margin and how they imprint themselves on our landscape. So we're going to talk a little bit about some volcanic processes, tsunamis, and then also with some landslides. The first is a little chunk of terrain about an hour east of Eugene, and if you've ever driven up the Mackenzie Highway all the way to Sisters and Santiam Pass and over to Bend and Redmond area, you'll go through this area, and most of what you see east of Eugene on this road are big trees. It is epically beautiful. It's one of my favorite drives around. Underneath all that is an awesome story. This is the PhD work of Natalia DeLine, who is now the volcanic hazards manager, scientist, chief scientist of all of New Zealand. So she's in charge of understanding New Zealand's volcanic hazards. She did her PhD working in our backyard up there at U of O with my colleague, Kathy Cashman. So underneath all these trees is the origin of Clear Lake. Clear Lake is incredibly important to Eugenians. It provides our drinking water. It is spring water. It's the most delicious water ever. My children are snobs because we travel and they do not drink tap water because they're such used to this great pure water that comes out of Clear Lake. It has been filtered by volcanoes that I'll show you in a second, but it is there. It is a great place to get water from because of lava flows. So underneath all those trees is this mosaic, this menagerie, if you will, of lava flows that dammed Clear Lake. So she did her PhD trying to understand that. And if you zoom in on some of those lava flows, they have this like viscous honey-like appearance. They're flowing across the landscape, and they're incredibly analogous to what's happening now in Hawaii. So if you think about these big fissures that you see videos of on the flanks of Kilauea and having these things flow down across these slopes, damming up a modern river, that's what it looked like about 3,000 years ago when Clear Lake was created. 3,000 years ago is not a whole long time ago. That is actually quite recent, geologically. So what she's able to do is use that detailed mapping to look at the geochemistry of individual flows, try to figure out which flows came from which sources, and also look at what they did in order to do that damming. So that little blue sliver right there you can see is Clear Lake. The dark line is the Mackenzie River Highway, and there's a bathymetric map of Clear Lake right there. All those little triangular pink and green triangles are drowned trees. So there was a forest growing on that valley floor that was drowned when those lava flows came in, dammed up the river, created that lake, and that happened 3,000 years ago. So you can go down and chip off parts of those trees and carbon date them and figure out that there was actually not just one damming episode, but a couple over about 300 years that episodically built this Clear Lake reservoir that Eugene is completely dependent on in terms of our drinking water. So one of these great illustrations of how LIDAR helps us understand the history and the origins of these features. Now, if I could take a ginormous slice through the Cascades, that story I just told you is playing out right in the middle of the High Cascade province right there. So that region of the South Sisters and Mount Bachelor and all the big stratovolcanoes that define the spine, the axis of the Cascades, are these recent volcanic flows that also have these long-traveled flows like I just showed you. They are this wonderful sponge that soaks up all that snow that accommodates, or it gets accumulated, I should say, over the winter. And over tens of years, that snow infiltrates into the rocks and then comes out at springs like at Clear Lake and these rivers. And as a result, it is just this great source of drinking water. So the processes, the frequency of eruptions in these places are being greatly improved by our ability to map the surface with LIDAR. So there's a little bit of volcanic history, and that story plays out almost everywhere you look. The great thing that LIDAR has done is it has facilitated new studies in places we thought we understood. So people have gone back to revisit these places and realize they're much more complicated, much more interesting than they ever imagined. Now let's talk a little bit about earthquakes. You guys hear a lot about earthquakes living right here on the coast. So I don't want to tell you about the subduction zone. You know enough about that. The one that ruptures that red surface below us today every 300 to 500 years or so. That's the source of the big subduction zone earthquakes. What doesn't often get talked about is the fact that on top of the overlying plate, there's a lot of smaller faults. We call these things crustal faults. These crustal earthquakes are just as interesting, just as important for seismic hazard. And one thing that LIDAR facilitated was the realization that there was a lot more of these faults in places like Seattle, where there's millions and millions of people that live. So what I'm going to show you right now is a zoom in of this little patch of terrain just west of Seattle. And if you go in there, you'll see there's this north-south fabric. Let me go back one page. This north-south scrape marks that define that landscape are driven by glaciers. So Seattle was overridden by an ice sheet 20,000 years ago, and that ice sheet left behind all these scrapes. So every time you see these north-south sort of corduroy fabric, that's driven by these big glacial landforms. But cross-cutting those are some of these smaller faults that actually were completely unidentified until the LIDAR came around. So this is in a neighborhood, almost 100,000 people live in this area, and there's this fault zone that no one had known about till 10, 15 years ago, or I guess about 2000, and it had generated at least 4 earthquakes in the last 2,000 years, the last of one of which generated a tsunami that inundated huge parts of the Puget Sound area. So not only did we not realize that there was a fault in their backyard, but also that this fault was very much active and very much something that needed to be incorporated into the understanding of zoning and engineering regulations for dealing with earthquakes in places like Seattle. So there's more of these types of discoveries happening because of the realization of the landscape. In that same little patch of topography I just showed you, there are also other little cool dispersed features, and this I'm going to transition into some landslide work, which is more similar to my own research labs activity. So these little yellow blotches, some of them are big in the upper left there, are where the landscape has been destabilized along the bluffs of the Puget Sound, and you've got material translating downslope as a result of these landslide activities. The most important one that we've heard about in our part of the world up here is the Oso landslide of about 4 years ago. Ron showed you a picture of it in his intro. A little over 4 years ago, 43 people were killed by this. Most of that happened in the foreground at the base of that landslide right over there, where the Stillaguamish River was chipping away at the base of this slope. The thing that made this landslide so deadly is how far it went out. It came down and then squirted across the valley about 1 mile. So it had a remarkable travel distance that was initially thought to be highly anomalous. This is a weird thing that just happened. So some of the first geologists, scientists that looked at this thought, this is an oddball event. Some really famous ones too. Thought this is something I never would have predicted. This is odd. Now, what I would tell you is that given the ability to map the surface, we would realize that this is not only the opposite of odd, it is something we should have expected. What I'm showing in red is the post-landslide LIDAR data that shows the topography as at the time of April in 2014, so 1 month after this event happened. So you can see the run out of that thing came all the way across the valley. The entire valley was overridden by the landslide material. It formed a temporary lake. All that smooth topography up valley of the landslide dam is a temporary lake that they had to drain through some engineering works. But I also want to point out, and this is when I do want to try to get my pen working, so bear with me. There we go. This feature, oops. Do I have to click a button on the pen, or can I use my shoot? I just did. I long for my laser. I'm sorry. I'll try to use this for now. Is that? Did it work? Oh, there it goes. Okay. So this feature right here, to the left of the Oso landslide, is one that occurred 500 years before the Oso landslide. This is called the Roering slide. It had been kind of known about, but not that much before the Oso event. This is a 6,000-year-old landslide, and this is a 4,000-year-old landslide. And every little scallop feature you see here is a ginormous landslide that has happened in the last 10,000 years in the Stillaguamish Valley. This place is absolutely shaped by these big slope failures. So what happened 4 years ago is par for the course. This is a geologic story that is revealed by the detailed features that are shown in the LIDAR data right here. With carbon dating, so material, forest, and trees that was overrun by this landslide, that's how the dates were obtained for this thing. So you can actually date the timing of these things, thousands of years old to 500,000 or 500 years old, and even in modern history. And one thing that was really powerful is the ability to realize that if you take a look at the details of this, these older ones are really smooth. So if you make a really roughened landslide like this that has all these sharp edges, these big blocks of rock and soil that have come down, and you let nature work at them for 10,000 years, they smooth out, they get more subdued, and they start to look like this. So that takes time, and so the transition from something sharp and jumbled to something smooth and diffuse, we can actually quantify with computational algorithms of this LIDAR data. And my former PhD student, who's now a professor at Portland State, estimated the age of all of these landslides in the Stillaguamish Valley. So Oso is shown in red right there. The Rowan one that's 500 years is in green. The really old ones that are more than 5,000 years old are shown in blue. And the green ones are sort of in this middle ground of a couple thousand to 5,000 years old. So just based on the character of the topography, the shape and how sharp those features are, and combined with carbon dating, we can guess, or we can map, I should say, and estimate the timing of all these features and figure out how often these things happen. And the recurrence interval of these big slides out here is about once every 150 years or so. So it's kind of like the earthquake hazard we think about. They happen in a big way, but they only happen every 100 to 200 years or so based on this type of analysis. So the LIDAR has completely opened up our ability to document the spatial pattern, also the temporal history of these features, which was an incredible revelation. The dramatic music is good at framing this. All right, so people in my hometown in Eugene, this same process plays out. So for Eugenians and other Oregon Ducks, this feature right here should be of note. That is Autzen Stadium, which looks like just a little O drawn right there. I-5 goes right here. So Springfield is here, Eugene is here. The Mackenzie and the Willamette meet right around here and go up north to Portland. And if you zoom in on a little patch of topography, this is Interstate 5 right here, just north of all that. This feature shown right here is a ginormous landslide bigger than the Oso one that came down 4 years ago in Washington. This thing is old, it's really smooth, so the first lesson you should take from this, based on what I just told you, is that the smoother these features are, the older they must be. We haven't dated this thing, but we know it's sometime in the last 5,000 to 10,000 years, based on some other geologic constraints we have in the area, but we know this thing would have been a whopper when it came down. And I-5 is nicely avoiding the toe of that thing today. In the Eugene-Springfield area, the maps of landslides has been completely updated as a result of this technology. So the state agency, the Dogami scientist, Ian Maiden, I know has been here years ago, they make maps now again because they have this LIDAR technology. So our ability to go and understand the distribution of landslides, how old they are, how active they're likely to be, is now greatly increased because of this. And so we can make much better depictions of potential landslide hazards and give you tools so you don't have to deal with buying a house or living in a place that might be impacted by something like this. So now I'm going to talk about the connection between these big earthquakes and landslides, because this is one of the big question marks. We know with a remarkable amount of precision how often these things have happened in the last 10,000 years. We have this great understanding of their occurrence every 300 to 500 years. We know very little about what they do on the actual landscape. So even though the ocean bottoms have given us this great record of subduction zone earthquakes, we don't know what's going to happen in where we live. The terrestrial response is largely unknown. So there have been efforts to try to model this. This is an Oregon State report that was commissioned by the Department of Transportation. ODOT said, tell us where you think landslides are going to happen when the next big earthquake occurs. And they took predictions of how big the earthquake shaking is likely to be. This is called peak ground acceleration. That's the amount of acceleration you'll experience during an earthquake. You combine that with information on how steep the slopes are, how strong or weak the rocks are, and you have a map of earthquake hazard. And I hate to say, but it's pretty dang red along the coast. Also, the routes getting us to and from the coast are potentially going to be greatly impacted. But there's really a lack of information. I can't put my finger on a single landslide that is due to the 1700 earthquake. We just don't have any information. So even though we think it's likely to generate landslides and a response in the landscape, I can't give you definitive evidence that says this feature right here resulted from the last big subduction and earthquake. So if you don't know something about the place you live, go somewhere else where it's happened recently. Geologists use the present as the key to the past. That's a classic tool that Ron and I and every other geologist will use in our classes. So if you go to a place like New Zealand, they had this big old earthquake a couple years ago. That's a fault scarp. So that is a place where the land has literally slid past and raised at least 10 feet. As you can see, the height of that new cliff created by those people. It was a massive earthquake. It was almost a magnitude 8, and it generated over 100,000 landslides. This is what the coast of New Zealand, there's a road that goes between the town of Christchurch and Kaikoura that was completely obliterated by this event. And, oops, I'm sorry, I'm having a technological challenges here. I should know better. But this is something that we need to think about. What is this going to look like here in Cascadia? Not only did it do things like this with big talus piles and lots of shallow disaggregated materials that came down on the roads, whole mountainsides came down and dammed up rivers and created lakes. And so there was this series of at least 50 large landslide dam lakes that resulted from this, then many of which are still around today. That was the inspiration, I guess you might put it, for our efforts to try to understand what the heck has happened in Cascadia in terms of a terrestrial response. We tried to use examples like that New Zealand earthquake and other earthquakes as our ability to try to date some of these features here in Western Oregon. I'm going to make a plea to some of you to help me with this in a second. So if you've seen some of these types of features, I would love to hear more about it. So what we've been doing over the last 2 years, here's Eugene. We're down here. There we are, right there. All of these red dots right here are a subset of the 10,000 ancient landslides that occur between the Willamette Valley and the coast. There's oodles of these things. This subset doesn't include any landslides that are connected to the last subduction zone earthquake. We know that, again, the date of that, January 26, 1700, because we just don't have the geologic information. So what we have been able to realize, though, is that at least 200, and that's shown by the red dots, of all these landslides have impounded small streams. So they've created dams like the one I just showed you in New Zealand, and they may permit us the ability to date when they happened and figure out if they are a source, or if they originated, I should say, from that last subduction zone earthquake. So what we're looking at here is landslides that came down, dammed a river, and now we have lakes as a result. So these red dots, there's over 200 of these things. These are beautiful little spots, typically nestled in wonderful little scenic spots, and they have often these ghost forests. So that's what I want to show you. This is one of our favorites. It's called Wasson Lake. You can go and catch a really nice trout if you like to go to really remote places, and there is a ghost forest out here. So very much akin to the ghost forest you guys have right here on the Oregon coast that resulted from the downdropping of the estuaries and the lowlands along the coast during the last subduction zone earthquake. So the last subduction zone earthquake dropped the landscape, and these trees got inundated by salt water and sediment, which killed them quickly, and the tree ring records were a big part of the story of determining the timing of that subduction zone earthquake. Our ghost forests in these little lakes formed by the landslide coming in, damming the river, and entombing these trees on this Paleo Valley floor. So this is our ability to map these. And again, the lidar has been front and center in terms of our mapping of these things. So this is the trees. If I wipe away the trees, there's Wasson Lake. There's the landslide that dammed it. And right along the margins of this thing are these stumps I just showed you a picture of. So just recently, about 2 weeks ago, I was out there with a PhD student named Will Struble. he's carrying an increment borer. So what we were doing on that day is we were coring trees on the landslide deposit itself, figuring out how old those were. We have also used the tree rings of these drowned trees to figure out to 1 year accuracy when that landslide happened. So I'm going to give you a sneak preview. There's more of these. As I showed you, these 200 of them. We've only been able to get out to 3 thus far because it takes a lot of work. If you know about the technology of chainsaws and how best to collect slabs of wood in settings like this, I would love to hear some advice for you. We've been looking into underwater chainsaws that are driven by pneumatics or hydraulics. I've also been looking at battery-operated lithium-ion powered chainsaws to operate in these places. Here's the challenge. We want to determine when this tree was alive, and we want to use the tree rings to do that, but we need to get a nice, well-preserved chunk of wood. The challenge is that the more that dead wood sits above the water line, the more it decomposes, and we can't get the tree ring record. So our interests are collecting samples right into that water line that are going to be well preserved, where we can polish the rings and collect them and do what I'm going to show you now. So that is a barcode, and that's a historic barcode because the fat rings are wet years, the small rings are dry years, and that encodes an incredible amount of information about climate in Cascadia. We've been collaborating with a guy who specializes in these things. His name's Brian Black, and he spent over 10 years coring live trees all over Western Oregon, and he's gotten trees all the way back to the 1500s. So single trees that show the tree ring record all the way from the 1500s to today. And the barcode, the up and down of the width of these tree rings tells us, again, these wet and dry years. And this allows us to figure out the age of when these landslides came in and dammed these lakes. So here's what you do. You take the individual trees that Brian has been out and cored and measured the rings, and this is a lot of laboratory work, and you correct for that. Or you take the growth rings out of it, because trees get wide early on and then their growth rate slows down. So this is taking away that growth curve and just the ups and downs of highs and lows. So high values are wet years and low values are dry years. And again, you've got 400 plus 500 years of climate from the single tree. So here's that reference record from living trees that Brian generated this. We have the tree rings from a drowned tree. We don't know when it died. So this is essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to match it up in time with the ring record that he generated. So it's literally an exercise like this until bingo. And you can't see it that great, but the match between our tree rings and the tree rings from his living trees is incredibly accurate. It's better than a match anywhere else, and it allows us to pin the date of that landslide to the year 1751. So we can determine to a single year, and even sometimes the time of the year when that landslide happened. This was in the winter months, according to Brian's analysis of the tree rings. We can also go to the trees that are living currently on the landslide deposit, and they date to about 1760 or 1770. There's Will coring those. And that means that it took about 10, 20 years for those new trees to start growing on top of that landslide after it came down. So it was a really nice correspondence of ages, all of it done with tree rings. And we had to know where to go, and that's where the lidar was really essential. So in our search, in our hunt for finding what happened during the last Cascadia earthquake, it's a little bit like looking for a needle in a haystack. It's a lot like looking for a needle in a haystack, I should say. We haven't yet to find a lake, a landslide that was generated in the 1700 earthquake, but we've found lakes that were created in 1751, 1812, 1738. We're in the right neighborhood. This technique works. This tool is the right tool for the job if we want to definitively associate a landslide with this last subduction and earthquake and then use it to help us understand the seismic hazard. But we have more work to do. So we have more students going out to continue with this effort. The last thing I want to highlight before finishing up tonight is LIDAR and other unrelated to geologic things, but environmental things. So I currently have a new project ramping up on the Eagle Creek Fire Complex. This is the one that was started last September, in early September. by some fireworks in the gorge, in the Eagle Creek area along the Pacific Crest Trail, Multnomah Falls, all these beautiful spots in the gorge that burned. This is what the landscape looks a month or two after that, and more pictures of that. The reason why this is such an interesting thing to think about is the landscape that burned is incredibly steep, and there was a lot of trees holding it together. So Portland is just off to the left. Here's the Columbia River here. This is Bonneville Dam and the Bridge of the Gods landslide right here. This area that burned is outlined in red, and this is among the steepest areas in the gorge. So in terms of having a landscape response, this place was absolutely incredibly sensitive to being burned, because all those trees are on really steep slopes, and there's all kinds of talus and loose rock, and the place has just been falling apart since that fire. So what we've done is we've been working with the Forest Service and the Bureau, the Army Corps and others to map the surface. The trail system is completely obliterated. So the Pacific Crest Trail is no longer passable through this area because of all the downed trees and rocks and landslides. So we're using another pass of LIDAR to map that and look at the erosional effects of the fire and look at the ecological recovery, and then also just do something completely practical, which is try to get the trail system back up on its feet and use the information we can do. So that's a brief sketch of how lasers are helping us understand Cascadia, your backyard landscape. I have to leave you with my favorite quote of the year. This came out in the New York Times in February. Lasers revealed that Mayan civilization, and this is in Guatemala, depicted civilization that was 10 times more people than they imagined previously. So essentially, the lasers showed that the amount of structures where people live was so much denser than they ever imagined, because again, they could see through the trees, that they updated their estimates of the civilization size by 10 times. So imagine going from 100,000 people to 1 million people in terms of their estimation. And my favorite quote is the scientist who said, "You just sort of have to bow down before the LIDAR and accept the fact that it's better than you are." So it's humbling, but it's real. I live it every day when we work on this. The key thing, though, is that this digital mapping from the air does not take over the work of being on the ground, collecting trees, collecting data, getting out, getting dates, and really understanding things. It helps us do that better. It helps us pinpoint where we want to go. It helps us focus our field work and be better geologists as a result. All kinds of great basic research and applied research is possible with this. If you're intrigued by this stuff, all you have to do is Google Oregon LIDAR, and it'll take you to the state agency's website, and you can go to your house, you can go to the beach, you can go to the mountains, you can look at all these volcanoes. Every image I just showed you, you can see from that website right there. You can turn the trees on or off. It's like playing God. It's absolutely spectacular. So I highly recommend you do that. If you're really into this kind of stuff, you can even download the data and get really nerdy with it like my students do. But that's but you can just do it from a browser. There is no software required. It's free. It's one of the great things that our state agency has done, is leverage contributions from state, federal, local agencies to get this amazing LIDAR map of Western Oregon. So I want to thank a ton of people that contributed to this, students, colleagues, and others, and thank you guys for coming out on a Saturday night.
So we've got time for a couple questions if anybody has anything. I'm going to go here first because then I can probably work my way over there.
As we're getting to the first question, this is the aesthetics of this data are spectacular too. So this is a picture of the Willamette River, where you can see that the river we see today is really just a minuscule fraction of what it used to be swimming across the Willamette Valley. So something nice to look at.
So I guess my question is that what was you think your expectations of how many landslides were you expecting with that kind of earthquake to occur? I mean, is it a dozen, 100, or 1,000? Should we be covered with lakes everywhere along along the valley?
That's exactly what we'd love to know, and I would expect thousands, but a lot of them small. Certainly areas where we've had road cuts are going to be more susceptible potentially, but I guess the big surprise is we don't know anything. So all the way from British Columbia all the way down to Northern California, there's not a single feature that has been definitively associated with that. So if it's been thousands, they've been pretty good at hiding from us for so long. And that's why we thought, let's try to look for these things systematically. And the only way that I have come up with to really confidently associate one of these events with the earthquake is with these tree rings. Carbon dating is useful, but it has error bars of about 20 years on either side. So you could come back with a landslide if you could date some tree that had overrun without the rings I'm talking about, which is with C14 dating, but you would still have a range of 40 years. So there's still a question mark as to whether the date was associated with the earthquake or not. That's why we think it's worthy to go out and try to find these things, because we're getting better at looking at these ones. These are the fresh ones. These are the ones that look like they could be about that right age. So we're narrowing the list of candidates, but it's still pretty striking that there's not more obvious ones that are jumping out. So I would expect thousands, but that's, don't quote me on that. I know this is being taped, but delete that footage, please. Yeah.
I wonder if there's anyone keeping track of movement of the face of our area towards the west. It seems to me like it may be moving.
What are you feeling? Moving.
It feels like the property that I own along Cape Ergo is moving westward.
There absolutely is movement. And so this technology has an accuracy of yay to yay, somewhere like several, maybe less than a foot or so. We have a network, and I say we, that's a collective we as scientists and society in general, a network of high-resolution GPS receivers out there that are measuring exactly what you're perhaps perceiving, which is the tectonic movement of the western U.S. And in particular, Oregon, and I wish I had a map of it, it's like a giant wheel. We are actually right here going slightly west, mostly north, and that is because of tectonic rotation that's occurring at about, a few centimeters a year. And that, what's that? You can feel, okay, you're better than I am. I'm impressed. You combine that tectonic movement with sea level and wave erosion and sort of a question of like, what's your reference frame? And that's often the hardest part, is moving relative to what. And when you have a dynamic ocean and you have interior and the western U.S. that's being pulled apart and stretched, it's hard to know where you are in all of that. But you're absolutely right. There is motion, and you can look at those maps on those same Dogami websites as well.
I was wondering if you could predict like future landslides through lidar, or if you could predict other ways of future ones from happening, or preventing, or trying to find ways to prevent it.
Yeah, prediction is one of the things we're not so great at. We can provide maps of susceptibility. So instead of, I would be really skeptical if I were you if someone said I can predict when that hill slope behind that house or on the beach flanks is going to fail. But maps that show these areas are more susceptible than others, those I think we can feel pretty confident about. So in terms of predicting what type of storm or what type of earthquake is going to make something happen, we're still a ways from that. But in terms of zonating relative hazard, we're getting much better at that.
So I'd like to thank Josh for making time in his schedule, because he's going to be taking back off for Eugene shortly, but I know he's more than happy to stick around for a little bit and answer some questions. I'd like to thank all of you for the entire year. I'd like to thank the Beetham family for their support, as well as the College Foundation, also the Mill Casino, Dallas and the IT crew, who have continually to improved the live stream. So if you have an opportunity to check in if you've missed any talks, or if in the future you're not able to make it in. They do a fantastic job with the live stream of all of our events. So thank you all as well, because your presence and your contribution certainly make this all possible as well. So feel free to hang out in the lobby for a little bit. Josh will hang around for a while and answer some additional questions, and check out what South Slough and the Coquel tribe have to offer, and keep an eye out for when we come back in October. So thank you all for your participation. Have a great rest of your weekend, and thank you again, Josh.
Thank you. And the technical issues were mine, not his. So.